thanks to Andrew and the organisers for inviting me. I'd love to go on with the conversation we were just having, actually, because it's really interesting and exciting, because I suppose, biology is kind of my first love in some ways. But Andrew suggested saying something on technology, and I think it maybe fits in now, right at this moment. So well planned on topics, at least. We'll see if it fits at all. And so I want to say something about what technology is, what it means to say that we're tempted by technology, and why that might or might not matter for divine action, because I'm not really sure that it is. It's more about human action, but then we come back to primary and secondary causes, and is this God working in humans, and in what way? And if they're fallen, can you see it? So it's a kind of a multi-step question. And the reason I picked the title isn't because I'm very interested in temptation so much, as that it comes from a quote from Wolfhard Pannenberg. Some of you might know his work on contingency and so on, and this is a super paper for teaching. It's 2 pages, and it sort of gives a history of the so-called conflict between science and religion for students. And he says this, and this is what the conference has been about, and it's been a really provoking in a kind of irritating way, but also really provoking in a thoughtful way the last few days, and I'm really delighted to see all the research people are doing, and the very, very contrary and sometimes really novel ways in which people are taking up questions. But he says this, in the present situation, I see no reason for assuming a fundamental conflict between science and religion. I think most of us would agree with that. The element of contingency and novelty in the course of natural processes is open to belief in continuing creation. We've heard kind of presentations on that. I mean, the other thing about concentrating on contingency and gaps, of course, is that God also works in the so-called order. So the order of creation is also God and divine action. And even when we say order, we don't necessarily know what order means. So it's kind of interesting that we've made a lot of contingency and gaps when order is also where God is revealed. But then he gives us this intriguing sentence at the end. It's a really short paper, and he brings in this line: "The temptations of technology are another matter." And of course, we often think of science in a sort of as an exercise or an exploration in truth, or some kind of shared truth. But technology is at a different level. The application of scientific ideas and the way we transform them into structures in the world and how then they affect us and so on is a different kind of thing. So what is techne? And it's action, but it's not ethics. So we're not really at the level yet of arete or virtue or something like that. We're at the level of what humans do. Sometimes what they do to stay alive, of course, but also sometimes what they do in order to do things like memorialize, to transform their ideas. Like earlier in the last lecture, transforming our abstract ideas into structures, and then those structures frame what we do next, and so on. So there's a kind of an ongoing process. So it's making, it's doing, it's craft, it's transformation. And there are lots of ways in which philosophers think about techne. So it's order imposed on skill. So humans have skills that are embodied skills that also embody in interesting ways. And it's manipulating the world to fit our purposes. And this is where temptation comes in, I think, in the question of good purposes and not so good purposes. So we're manipulating the world to fit our purposes. And it's a kind of knowledge as well. It's a kind of knowledge. It's a knowledge through making. And you know this if you were a gardener, that you can't learn how to dig from a book. You have to go out and you have to kind of dig, and that's the way it works. But it is also, for some philosophies, the first thing we know, the most important definitive thing we know. So Socrates has said something like, although we'd have to see what he meant, that it's the definitive knowledge because we know immediately what it is for. We can do something with it. It helps us to operate in the world. And of course, at its more kind of elevated, you could say, the technique that we know should be worthy of the order of the universe. So there's something about the order of the universe, whether that order has contingency in it or not, there's something about the order of the universe to which technique kind of acts or responds. And in theology and history, of course we thematize human doing before we think about ethics, I think. So we have lots of different models, and we've heard some of them in the conference. Participation in the divine work of creation, for example, like secondary cause, if you like. Somebody mentioned today steward. Of course, steward is often in the tradition, often in certainly in environmental ethics. It's about how we look after the rest of creation, so the role of the human person in that kind of having dominion and so on. So it's kind of other than human nature oriented. And then you have, and it's for some people that's already too anthropocentric. It's not kind of nature centric enough. And on the other side, you have models of co-creation, where the human person is actually doing God's job in the creation, which could be seen by some models as quite hubristic. So one is kind of they're oriented towards the rest of creation, and the other is oriented towards God. So you have lots of debates. Panentheists talk about co-creators and created co-creators, and what kind of hubris might be involved in assuming that we're creators and not just makers. Of course, makers is a safer word. It also comes up in how we act in anticipating redemption. So early scientists, for example, talk about rebuilding the garden in order to share the sort of using science to reconstruct paradise, and also to share the sort of the fruits of creation with everybody. So the model of the return to the garden is one model to do well associated with redemption. And then you also have the model of healing and restoring the world. So instead of having a juridical model of sin, which I think you have in the original sin, you have a sort of a healing model. So we're ill, we're not living authentically, we have to find a way to heal ourselves and to live well. So you have that model, the idea of building the kingdom in the here and now, because it's an anticipatory kingdom, it's a sort of proleptic eschatology. If the future is the kingdom, then we have to start from here and we have to build towards that. And there are other models, like in Isaiah, that we're not just, of course, going back to the garden. That isn't the model of salvation the tradition gives us. I mean, at the end, of course, it's the cosmopolis, the end time city, but it's the transformation of all creation. And it's not just the human person who's redeemed, it's the whole of creation is redeemed. So you have a sort of immanent transcendence, or a transcendent immanence. You have the possibility of being in the world, but also transcending that. You can do that in a pantheistic way, or a pantheistic way, or a panentheistic way, or in other ways, maybe more Thomistic and so on. But nonetheless, in the transformative model, nature is a co-worshipper. Nature is also destined for salvation. We didn't hear too much about the rest of creation when we were talking about salvation. It also awaits salvation, as we hear in Romans. But the difficulty, of course, with making and doing is that when we make and do, we transform reality in a way that then affects what happens next. And in Laudato Si', I'm sure many of you have read Laudato Si', which is focused on care for our common home. The text talks about the technocratic paradigm. So the way in which we don't just transform things that are and make them useful, but then we change the world in a way that then makes us less free, because it has changed it forever. So technology frames realities. So we change things, and those structures then determine what we do next. And we would say that about transport. If we wanted a sustainable transport system, we wouldn't start from where we are now. But cars have shaped our cities in ways that it's difficult to recover from. So technology shows us how, but not necessarily why. And the key contrast in the philosophy of technology is really this one. Is technology an expression of human desire? So there's, again, the question of where temptation might come in. These are our desires. We want things. It's an expression of human desire, which can be ordered or not ordered. Or is it then all determining and, in fact, negating human agency and freedom? So it's an expression of our agency, or it eventually turns on us and makes us less free and impacts on our agency. And this Rottenberg is a philosopher of technology in New Jersey Institute of Technology. He says this: the tool solves a problem, and then it creates new and more thorny issues not dreamable before. Technology, unlike science, and I think this is where we part ways, does not even claim to reveal larger truths about what exists. So it's not interested in revealing larger truths about what exists, but hints at more ways for humanity to change the world. So it's imminent in that sense. It's born of simple need and want, but it emerges as an agent of human evolution. Now we might have to say more about that statement and in what way it plays into being kind of part of human evolution. But it is this case that the tool then becomes the master in some ways. And the temptation in that, and this is in Antigone, techne has a sort of an ingenuity. Technology is ingenious in a way that it can hide what's called unexpected guile. So we're never quite sure how it's all going to turn out and how it might turn out for us. So it extends our reach. So it extends the human reach, like a telescope and a microscope, and we've heard a lot about that in the last few days. How we can know more about what's out there and what's in here. But it's not practical wisdom in the sense of ethics. So it's not at the level of arete and virtue, but I want to come back to ethics at the end. So the clock, and we've heard about the clock as well, is an image of time, but it doesn't correspond with any physical part of the world, although we had lots of ways in which people try to make it so in the last few days. So it is an image in that sense. And what we forget, and I think people remembered and forgot it in different ways during the conference, is that all reality is mediated. All reality is mediated, and it's mediated in language, whether that's the language of maths or language of biology or chemistry or physics or theology for that matter. And what is given, and this is something I think feminist theologians have highlighted quite a lot, what is given cannot be had without interpretation. So even though we make statements and we have data and we present measures, we still have to interpret. So whatever is given has to be interpreted. And the question for ethics, of course, and I do want to come to ethics in the end, is can we have a non-instrumental relationship then with creation? And I specifically want to say creation here and not nature, and make the point that nature is what the empirical sort of sciences study, and creation is what theologians talk about. And these are categorically different, just like creator and creation are categorically different, and it's important to keep them apart. And actually somebody, I think it was you were talking about, Aquinas uses nature to talk about physics, and Hawking uses creation to talk about nature, and it gets quite confusing because you wonder what do they refer to, because of course if you say creation, you imply creator, even if it's a sort of end time creator or something like that. And of course we've managed to mismeasure the human person more than once and in many different ways. And we so you probably know about this science of craniometry, where you measure the size of someone's skull and then you infer their intelligence from that. And physiognomy was the science of looking at people's faces and being able to tell, something about their criminality or their preponderance for a sin or something like that. So these were old sciences, or at least they seem to be old sciences. And Stephen Jay Gould, I'm sure some of you or many of you are familiar with his work. He actually fits into what Conor was talking about, I think, earlier. The scientist that can also dialogue with culture. I mean, a great essayist, paleobiologist, but also a wonderful writer and a communicator of science. He was once asked, did you deliberately do this? And he says, no, I'm just following, Galileo and others, who tried to make their ideas intelligible to people. And so we mix up things like the difference between the descriptive and the normative. So we say something is the case, and then we make an inference from that. So are women's brains smaller than men's brains? He's this wonderful essay about women's brains. Are women's brains smaller than men's brains? Maybe, nobody wants to say. Could you imagine? Might they be? Why are you so reluctant? You're afraid you might be accused of something. If I ask students this, they usually say, yes and no in different numbers. But yeah, women's brains are smaller than men's brains. But why might that be? Why might that be? It's kind of obvious. Yeah, exactly, because women are generally often smaller than men. So when he looked at the data, of the craniometry data that said that women's brains are smaller, therefore they're less intelligent, he managed to also say, well, actually women's brains, if you adjust for body size and so on, are not smaller than men's. So it's not really, one doesn't follow from the other. So you have the data and you have the measure, and then you have the measure being interpreted in a way that's a kind of a it doesn't follow, and Gould talks about this too, the mismeasure of the human person. But of course, that was in the 19th century. This is Inishbofin in Ireland. It's an island off the west coast, and Trinity College Dublin has just given back 13 skulls in the last few weeks to Inishbofin that were stolen from the medieval monastery. Because the scientists from Trinity had gone off to measure the heads of the people who lived in Inishbofin to see, whether they were clever or whether they weren't very clever, or whatever it is they wanted to do. And we tend to see that as poor science, right? We can identify poor science, but as Gould said, we don't always identify it in our own time. Now he's writing in the 1990s. He talks about this measure of intelligence quotient, or IQ. And it's used a lot in the States. I think it still is. A lot of students do tests which are IQ-like before they enter colleges and so on. And what Stephen Jay Gould says in his very interesting interview about whether IQ is a factor or a value, he says, well, it's a measure whose meaning is unclear. We don't know what its meaning is. We don't know when we get the answer whether this has something to do with nature or nurture, or why somebody kind of falls in this place on the spectrum. But it presupposes a whole lot of things, any of which are wrong means it's not true, if you like, or it's not applicable. So he says it presupposes that there's a meaningful number. And that's what we do in technology. We make interfaces that kind of deal with alterity or otherness and give us a meaningful number and something useful then comes out of that. It was a little bit like today, I think, when Stacey said that you have to trust your instruments. They're no longer like the instruments that are in the Science Museum, where you can see the action kind of in the work and the measure being made. They give you a little dial, with maybe a digital feedback, and that's so we have to trust that there's something called a meaningful number. And then when we do that, we rank that in some way and correlate it with an outcome. If you get this score, you're this clever, and if you get that score, well, you're clever in a different way. And of course, if we want to make that an issue of groups and maybe use it to define races, for example, which has been done in the States, then you have to say that's highly heritable. It may not be highly heritable. You may have a low IQ, but it might not be highly heritable. And also that it's effectively unchangeable. It's immutable. And yet, of course, that's also not true, because if you're born with poor eyesight, you can have it remedied by something as simple as this, So it's not immutable. Actually, IQ, as Gould points out, was first designed not to say something essential about the human person, but was an educational tool. It was supposed to kind of give a glimpse to the teacher of where you were in your ability to study and so on, and not something essential about the human person. And yet we still see it as, or maybe some of us don't, we still see it as a measure of something, and we use things like it to rank students. I sometimes think those kind of tests, those entry tests, are used to rank students so that you can weed out the ones that might need extra help, and it costs you less, and you can, maybe there's a sort of a function in there, I don't know. And some of you might be familiar with Sam Harris, a philosopher of a sort, who wants to revive IQ as a measure of the differences between people, and as late as 2007 say, of course, people don't like IQ anymore, because it's not PC to talk about IQ, or let's get the record straight, he says. We do need a more precise classification of people. So people don't want to hear about it because people don't want to hear that IQ differs over race and ethnic groups. So he wants to revive it in 2017. And we say, yeah, but that's just bad science again, right? It's really bad science. And yet we're still at it. We're still doing it. We're still trying to find a measure of the human person that we can use in a sort of functional functional way. And you might be familiar with these face recognition technologies that are being used for security at the, and sometimes by law enforcement agencies. IBM decided to stop with this technology, which is very unusual for a tech company, because they didn't want to make it because they saw that it was opinion in code, that it was rubbish in, rubbish out. You build into the system what your culture reflects. So if your culture reflects a certain kind of racism or sexism, then it'll be reflected in the code. So your computer may actually end up being more biased than you are. So IBM have got out of it, and Microsoft have just got out of it. And there's a huge debate going on right now in Ireland about whether or not when the guards get their body cameras, they'll have facial recognition technology at use in there. And civil liberties people are saying, well, maybe this isn't a good idea because it's so faulty. It recognises people as having kind of criminal faces, which is a bit like physiognomy all over again, and creates security problems for them. So we're still doing it. We're still trying to find a technology that sort of distills what it is to be human, for example, and then use that in a useful way, because that's what we want technology, because it's useful. So these are all mirrors of ourselves, really. The craniometry. We're looking at ourselves when we measure ourselves. IQ testing is the same. Algorithms for facial recognition. And it's mistaking function for reality. There's a great line in Laudato Si where the text says, realities are greater than ideas. That's actually Francis quoting himself, because it's from Evangelii Gaudium. But I think it's a really interesting phrase to hang on to, is that realities are greater than ideas. So all the models we have of physics and chemistry and how the world works, and the world out there and the world in here and the world down there, are mediated. They're mediated. We don't have access to reality. Now, I know we just had a discussion about maybe you do if you're a Thomist working in the medieval framework of realism, okay? But most of us aren't working there most of the time. And all of these things are signals of our intention. And people talked earlier about signals. And that was another conversation that couldn't be had because we were moving on. But these are signals of our intention. So we want to do certain things. These are our desires. We want to do them. And they suggest intentions, but they also suggest new intentions. So we have extensions then of our desires. We have desires on our desires and so on. So the telephone is an extension of the drum, in a way, you could say. Chatbots, chatbots like ChatGPT and Bard and all of these new things that everybody's getting worried about in the university because students are never going to learn anything ever again, is the extension of the book. A long, long time ago, the ancient philosophers said writing is a terrible thing because it damages memory. So we shouldn't be writing even. So we're it's the extension of facial recognition is really an extension of craniology or craniometry, if you like. And where does the temptation come in? Well, we agree to let our desires to be manipulated and tested. We agree, we see something new and shiny. Everybody has a phone, I'm pretty sure, and we want to play with it. We see a new screen, we want to play with it. We see a new possibility, we want to play with it. So we agree to let our desires be manipulated and tested. So first we have a car, then we have a phone, then we have a car phone, and it just goes on and on like that. So we change the world. And then the world changes us in a way back. Recently this is a drone delivering, very trivially, some Just Eat food in Oranmore in Galway. And it was a test, there's a company who want to develop, drone capitalism, and the EU are talking about new rules for, the sky, and how people are talking about the full sky. Soon we'll have these pesky little things flying everywhere around us, and, up and down our lanes and looking over our garden walls and so on. And what happened with the Oranmore test actually was interesting. People who were receiving the food had to be trained. They had to be trained to receive it, So it's just like we have to be trained to drive on the road. We have to be trained to, do this and signal and so on. So then the robots are training us. Very interesting. So you have to, because you don't get hit by the food, or it doesn't get eaten by the dog or something like that. So you have to wait for the robot, and you have to, and so we might happily kick our dishwashers or our washing machine or something like that. But in the end, this technology kind of corrals us in interesting ways. And the question then is, do we really want to make this our life's work? You know, is this kind of technology really where we want to put our energies? And where does nature and creation come in? And I do want to keep them distinct. And it kind of helps sometimes when you're thinking about the difference between theology, say, and science. Well, for Rottenberg, who's a philosopher now, he's not a theologian, alignment with nature is always part of theories that hope to direct technological change. So there's something about nature that we say puts a brake on what we do, or there should be. And from a theological point of view, we might say there's something about creation that would tell us, you know, we should put a brake on some of the things that we want to do, because it has something which is hard to articulate, some kind of intrinsic value. The givenness of creation, I guess, is what we sometimes talk about. Grace, for example, is part of it. And we have to then ask the question, we have to do more work with new technology, of course. We have to regulate it because it's interfering in our life world. But we have to ask questions like, well, what is it about nature, of the human person, or nature as in the extra human kind of nature that we want to protect? What is it that can't be replaced? What is it we don't want to destroy? So we have to ask ourselves those questions again and again. And often when we come to sort of robots and robotics, for example, the comparison between human and machine is often negative, right? You know, people want robots in work situations because they don't get sick. They don't have children. They're not vulnerable. You know, these are negative comparisons. Computers are faster. They're clever. They do more than we do. Of course, only in one way, but it's still considered an interesting way, rather than it being a means of connection between people. I think it's, I leave verses in epistles, in Laudato Si, number 18, the Pope talks about the way in which technology can be connecting, but also can be disconnecting. And so rather than being a means of connection between people, the technology sees human vulnerability and frailty as the problem. And this digitization also brings tensions with the other than human, and I think we need to think about that in relation to technology and in new ways. And the example I want to give is there's a lot of moves now to have, you know, smart cities. You've probably heard of smart cities. Smart cities are, you know, potentially more sustainable. But there is a tension between smart and sustainable cities. So the city over here on the left is a kind of smart city where everything is digitized and you have a lot of switches and you have a lot of entrepreneurs. And I mean, that's the model of the city, is where the market happens, and there's a lot of money to be made in smart cities, and there's a lot of people, you know, want to get involved in smart cities. Or do we think about the sustainable city? You can see which city this is now, I think, you know, okay, from the landmark. So, you know, instead of thinking of the city as a low nature value, high culture value place, you start to see the city as a biome in itself, or an ecosystem in itself. It isn't non-natural, it is itself the habitat of humans, and most of us live in cities, and most of us will live in cities. So is the smart city the way to go, or the sustainable city, or are they different? And you know, and there is some data kind of emerging from the moves to smart and digitization of cities, that the evidence shows that they're not inherently green, because we overestimate the decoupling of consumption. So the idea that if you're more efficient, you'll be more effective. You know, reduce, reuse, recycle will only delay the inevitable. It doesn't actually get us to where we want to go, which is, you know, circular economy, or all those words, you know, cradle to cradle, every output becomes an input, you know, a sustainable society. So we overestimate the decoupling from consumption that digitization brings. We also reimagine the human person in another way, as a worker consumer of digital products, you know. So you have the ideal consumer, ideal citizen is a worker consumer, and you get lots of new inequalities. We've seen them in Ireland already. So you have, because you're digitally smart, you can have Airbnb, you can have Uber, you can have taxis at your disposal. you can have Dropbox, and you can have all these facilities that other people who aren't digitally smart can't have. And you know, the big row in Ireland at the moment about accommodation is that, you know, all the tourists are in the houses, you know, the Airbnb, lovely places to go, and all the refugees and homeless are in the hotels. And this kind of creates a new inequality. Or you know, if you have Uber, you can get a taxi when your granny's left on the street because she doesn't have Uber. You know, she doesn't know how to use the technology. So there are new inequalities being built in, and you can't have solar panels on a house that you don't own, or that you don't have some kind of oversight over. So there's advantages people will get from digitization that others won't, and it'll deepen inequalities, or could deepen inequalities. I'm not anti-technological. I'm just asking, are these driving in the right direction? And of course, the other thing is that even if you make savings on solar or something like that, you'll still use the money to spend it on something else, and sometimes you'll spend it on even worse things. So that's the temptation of technology. So you fixed your house with solar, now you want a new car. You know, it's got to be electric, and it's got to be really good. And of course, the most environmentally friendly car is the one you have. You know, you should hang on to the car you have, not buy a new car, because it's going to cost the planet. So, you know, it assumes a lot of things about psychology and humans and technology. A long-term switch, for example, or that savings are diverted to other goods. And what happens actually with the digitized city is that the environment becomes marginalized. It's not really about the environment at all. It's about using, just like we used to use, you know, cancer research to justify big grants, or, you know, feeding the world. You know, I want to do this tiny little thing. It's going to feed the world, so I want to get funding. You know, that's what people do. So you get poor kind of ecosystem buy-in, if you like. And so we need to reframe the kind of rights and powers in an algorithmic society, and not treat humans, yes, but citizens as digital users. So not just to think of ourselves as digital users. If we want sustainable cities, we have to build the environmental objective in from the start. It has to be built in from the start. And if we want to do it, it probably isn't going to work entirely on venture-driven projects, just like housing. Everybody doesn't work on venture-driven projects. You have to cooperative and democratic platforms that allow people participation and involvement in that. So we're moving into the kind of ethics questions. This is a sponge city that isn't run digitally at all, but is run on the kind of switches of nature. So the water comes in, it goes into the lake and the drainage and the plants then act as a sponge, and when it's warm, it transpires, and then you get cooling of the city. It's only a perfect kind of water cycle, and there are lots of cities in China being built on this kind of cradle-to-cradle sponge model. Berlin is a sponge city, or moving towards a sponge city. It's not a smart city in the sort of high-tech meaning of technology. It's a low-tech city. And in fact, low-tech technology could be also the answer to we have to harness technologies that work. If you go to any apartment block in Spain in the summertime, you'll find a place to hang out your clothes. Imagine, let the sun do it. It's all for free. So what are the theological responses then that might come from analysing technology in that way? Well, theological and philosophical, I suppose. We shouldn't be afraid of technology, I suppose. I mean, that's one thing we need. If we are agents, then we have to recover our agency when it comes to technology. We're not victims of fate, but nor are we masters of our destiny. Technologies will change our world, and they'll change them possibly forever. I mean, certainly biodiversity loss at the moment is a forever thing. You know, there is a great extinction going on that's immediate, and this is even in advance of all the problems that might come with climate change. We need to be conscious of the de-worlding at the technical interface. Because technology foregrounds functionality, it conceals complex operations like fragility, insecurity, vulnerability, contingent interactions, agency, all the things we care about. That's us, people, life, and so on. So we want order, we want to corral things, we want to manage things, we want control, but actually the most interesting things in our lives are these kind of contingent and spontaneous and relational aspects of agency, if you like. And we do have unconditional obligations not to instrumentalize the other. So that's part of what it means to recognize other people's dignity. So that's a sort of an idea in the common good approach. Of course, solidarity is part of that. And we also have obligations to promote the interests of all, And that all could be more than just humans, of course, also the all of the natural world, other creatures, river systems, whatever all you can think of. And so instead of thinking, well, our ethics is reactionary, people often say, well, the ethics can't keep up with the new technology. And this is usually referred to as ELSA, somebody invents something like drones, and then we have, an ethical, legal, social analysis kind of chasing on its tail, if you like, and we're asking, how are we going to regulate this? How are we going to make it safe? How are we going to protect our privacy and consent and other species and birds and the sky and all of these other things? We have to think in terms in a different way, from a different perspective, from a social ethics perspective. As Hilla Hacker says, Hilla Hacker is a theological ethicist in Chicago, from Tübingen originally. And she says this: the social ethical analysis of science and new technologies demands that we reverse the perspective from ELSA to SE, so to building our ethics in. And it asks which societal goals, in fact some of these goals are obligations. That's an interesting point. It's not all about teleology and the good life, it is also about our obligations, things we've signed up to, like the Birds Directive, for example, or the Habitats Directive, or something like that. Which of these are the most urgent from the perspective of human rights claims, and which social practices are best equipped to bring about those changes? So we have new technologies, they're scaring us at the moment. I don't know if you saw last night on the news, there was a photographer who withdrew his photograph from an exhibition, a Sony photo exhibition, because he won the prize, but the photograph was AI generated. He didn't take the photograph. So people are getting quite scared by this. We've had directives coming down from the senior lecturer saying, how are you going to deal with the ChatGPT? Because the thing about ChatGPT is that it gives you a different answer every time, right? So you can never trace the material that the student has taken from the machine, and you can do it in all sorts of styles as well. So it's very hard to detect that they've used it. What we did in the school this year was we asked the students to review a paper, and then to also review at the same time a review generated by ChatGPT for the same paper, and see what happened. Do they recognise some of the inanities of the machine, or also mistakes that the machine can make, or the misjudgments. I mean, for example, they were reviewing Bertrand Russell's A Free Man's Worship, and the machine told the student that he was trying to harmonise science and religion in some way, which is kind of interesting, a categorical mistake. And what about justice and questions of justice? And this is where it's not just a question for Christians or for the Christian churches, it's a question for humanity in interesting ways. We have to work together in that sense. That justice is a complex goal that needs to be justified from different spheres. So there are different ways in which people thematize justice. So we can have a model of sustainable development, but our model of sustainable development is only as good as our model of justice. And that's a complex thing. People will often talk about the sustainable development goals and they list them like a shopping list, but a lot of them are in conflict with each other. And how do you find a way to deliver on them without some kind of concept of a shared understanding of justice and sustainability? We need to create institutions of shared sovereignty. It's interesting, we can orient ourselves differently. We can be virtuous ourselves, of course, but we need institutions that will deliver on our obligations, not just on rights, because on the other side of rights, of course, there is obligations. That if we create institutions that can deliver on our obligations, we can do more than just kind of acting virtuously on our own, or even in our church communities or something like that. And that in the end, really, it's not about reaffirming the position of our friends, whether they're our ecclesial friends or not, but exchanging different views, in a pluralist society, and trying to find a way to live with our temptations for technology, and think about how we do that while also meeting our other goals and obligations like sustainable development, or well, I mean, it kind of says it all: sustainable development, I suppose. Sustainable planet and justice for everybody. So that's my contribution. Okay, it's yeah, I think that's it. Okay. Okay.